1,000 years ago tomorrow, in a small principality not far from here, there was once a chief inventor who had kept himself occupied for most of his adult life with devising a machine that would translate touch into sight. The machine looked something like this. Note that the network of pins at the back of the great throne are connected to an optical device. This device communicates real-time visuals to the pins. Upon receiving the image from the device, the pins assemble into a configuration that represents the image. This is in turn gently impressed upon the back of the user. After some training, individuals with eyes that did not work reported experiencing two-dimensional images through the pins. Though unable to describe the exact location of these images, they called the experience seeing, for want of a better word. The users reported confusion between identifying when an object was moving past them and when they were moving past an object. They had great trouble getting to grips with perspective and could only ascertain that an object was further away on account of its being higher up in their so-called visual field. Considerable difficulties were experienced in comprehending that a plastic horse seen from the front and seen from the side were, in fact, the same object. The users mentioned that when the frame of the optical device was fixed, they still experienced the images, but they were also conscious of the pins pressing upon their backs. They preferred it when the chief inventor mounted the camera upon their heads, because it was only then that they forgot about the pins and became entirely immersed in the image. The chief inventor developed an interest in teaching the users to recognize beauty. Marble heads of young men and women were placed before the subjects. The sculptures were from the collection of the chief inventor himself, and all the staff were in agreement that they were indeed priceless items of uncommon beauty. Many years passed, and it wasn't long before the chief inventor's son was following in his father's footsteps. Keen to outdo the chief inventor's son masterminded a machine that could turn sound into sight. A new group of people with eyes that did not work were collected up from around the kingdom and called into the inner sanctum of the palace to have chips implanted in their ears, which were in turn connected to small mechanical eyes suspended upon stalks above their heads. The eyes took in the space and translated it into a series of sounds that, to the delight of everyone, materialized as defined images somewhere inside the users. The users were subjected to an array of experiments in a very private place, deep inside the palace. As with the previous experiments, the subjects initially struggled with the laws of visual comprehension. However, it wasn't long before they had learnt to see entire rooms through sound. After that, drawing users' attention to the refined beauty of the palace in relation to instilling an awareness of the stupid ugliness of their own humble dwellings took no time at all. Unbeknownst to the chief inventor's son, a young woman amongst the group had taken to recording the sounds that conjured the jewel-encrusted rooms of the palace. She derived significant pleasure from replaying these sounds within the walls of her own bedsit. She'd learnt that this bedsit might be described using words like miserable or ugly. In response to this, during days at the palace, she carefully memorized the order of her movements right down to the slightest angling of her head as she spun around the expansive halls of mirrors and cut glass that reflected gold trimmings and candelabras ad infinitum. As the days were getting warmer and springtime was upon the kingdom, the young woman began to think about transforming the dusty and also highly miserable and ugly communal yard outside her building. She took to peeling off from the group to record and edit together a soundtrack that reconstructed the manicured palace gardens to fit like a glove to the dimensions of her yard. The leaky pump became a fountain playing. The wheelie bins became privet hedges pruned into perfect cubes. By this time, her activities had begun to arouse suspicion. The chief inventor's son sent his spies to observe her, and when it was discovered that she had been stealing space from the palace to reinstall in her own home, she was immediately arrested. As the judge put on his robes in preparation for sentencing, he suddenly understood that it was quite unnecessary to waste taxpayers' money on sending the woman to the already overpopulated prisons of the kingdom. Instead, the chief inventor's son was commissioned to create a single recording of the smallest cell within the worst of the jails that would play on an eternal loop, regardless of where the woman ran to. Meanwhile, someone at a bus stop was overheard regretting the fashion in which the users had been trained in the act of seeing. The marble statues owned by the chief inventor were, after all, inferior to the works in the collection of the chief curator. Many years later, when the chief inventor's great-great-great-great-granddaughter was researching the case of the woman who stole space from the palace, it suddenly became clear that if all the kingdom could be persuaded to submit to a visual interface that somehow simulated improvements to the quality of life, then it might follow that many obstacles to the running of the country would become invisible.